I want to ask you, Kevin, can you tell our audience who you are and how you got involved with politics way back when?
Well, my involvement with politics begins with a man named Rushdoony, Rousas Rushdoony, who wrote a book called Institutes of Biblical Law, in which he proposes how we would, I think I could say, once again, apply biblical law to our society. And I say once again because the Puritans in New England, trying to build a city on a hill, applied biblical law to their society and made America a Christian nation. But we lost all that. So Rushdoony was saying, here's what we should do is we should do that again. Here are some changes probably we should make not necessarily adopting everything the Puritans did in early America, but close. So anyway, as I read Rushdoony, and then as I read the Bible, because Rushdoony is big on the Bible as an authority, as the Word of God, as something we should be following, a blueprint for our society. As I began looking at that blueprint, Rushdoony is a very strong critic of the government, of the state. He's a critic of what he calls statism, which is the worship of the state, trusting in the state rather than God for our prosperity and our peace. So I adopted that framework of looking at the Bible as a blueprint written out by God for us to follow. And as I looked at that blueprint, I didn't see any place at all for the government. It seems to me that the Bible condemns the government. So I didn't want to use the word anarchist because Rushdoony hated the word anarchist and anarchy. But then in college, I took a course from someone named John Hospers. He was, I think, at one time the chairman of the philosophy department at USC. Then he ran for president on the Libertarian ticket in, I think 1972, and then came back. And I took a course from him in political philosophy. And one of the texts in his course was his own book called Libertarianism. And the other book was a book called For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard. Rothbard is willing to call himself an anarchist, and I thought his book was great. It was, I guess you could all say, a blueprint for a libertarian society. He called himself an anarcho-capitalist, that is to say, a capitalist that's consistently capitalist, consistently against socialism, communism, fascism, all those other isms. And I thought, you know what? I think I could call myself an anarchist. If Murray Rothbard will call himself an anarchist, that's good enough for me. Hospers, on the other hand, would be called a minarchist. He did not agree with Rothbard on abolishing all the state, not just unconstitutional bureaucracies like, say, the Department of Education, but everything that involved coercion, theft, violence, aggression against other people, which that's what the state is. If you don't have theft, if you don't have aggression and violence, you don't have government. So I was willing to call myself an anarchist at that point, although I knew that was a word that just wasn't very popular, wasn't very marketable, but I knew what I was at that point. So that's in the mid 1970s.
Okay. Let's stop right there for just a second.
Okay.
So when you were reading Rushdoony, who was your mentor, correct?
Right.
You were reading Rushdoony and kind of like hearing from him his critique of the state, which was a plethora of things. And so you didn't actually get on the train of anarchism but you were seeing that there was some maybe inconsistencies, or did you feel anything then with under Rushdoony that like, well, maybe we need to go a little farther with this? If your critique is so plentiful of the state, and then when you went and read Rothbard, did it all just the pieces kind of fall into place for you? And then how was that not was there any conflicting feeling as a Christian reading Rothbard with, you know what I'm saying?
I didn't have a problem reading Rothbard because Rushdoony's critique of the state is very profound, very deep, very emphatic. Most of the time when Rushdoony talks about the state, he's critical of it, and profoundly so. I mean, deep, muscular, robust criticism of the state. That's mostly what you read from Rushdoony. However, if you say, well, gee, if you're saying all these things about the state, wouldn't you be an anarchist? And he would say no. And he always falls back on a few passages like Romans 13, which he believed said human beings have to have a state. We have to have a government. And so he was relentlessly not an anarchist. But I thought, that's just old school, because again, I was looking at Romans 13 through different eyes, particularly through the eyes of the Anabaptists and people like John Howard Yoder, who
Okay,
were
okay, but when did you get? That's a great question. So I want to bring this up. So Rushdoony had those like set of verses that he would go to, and obviously you wanted to like do justice to Rushdoony's work and try to you were probably wanting to dig into this, I'm guessing, some more and went to Romans 13 to examine it more. Is that what happened? And then you found some alternate interpretations that you felt were more consistent, or like how did you know that Rushdoony, when did you come to that realization that Rushdoony was not correct on Romans 13?
well, I'm not very good on chronology as far as remembering how this happened exactly, but I did come to understand that Rushdoony's reliance on Romans 13 was a reliance based on tradition rather than exegesis. In other words, Rushdoony, for the most part, is going through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation and looking at the text specifically and saying, here's what the Bible is saying. Here's what the Bible is saying. But if you do that, I think you end up being an anarchist. But Rushdoony would then say no, because Romans 13 says you can't be an anarchist. But at that point, he's not really doing exegesis of Romans 13. He's saying Romans 13 has traditionally been interpreted by the church, by theologians, as requiring a state. But that's just tradition. He's just saying Romans 13 is what theologians say requires us to not be anarchist. But he's not really looking at the text, because the text itself, just to start off with, the text is talking about something called the powers, and all the other texts in the New Testament which use that word powers are speaking of demonic forces. And Romans 13, I believe, is talking about a demonic institution. And it's simply saying, don't engage in a violent overthrow of this demonic institution. In other words, it's a pacifist approach to the government, but it's not a favorable approach to the government. I believe Christians in the first century were understanding that the state is demonic and that Jesus alone is our Savior and our Christ and our King, our state, our government, our governor. Only Christ is governor, not Caesar. So that's why they were in conflict with Caesar. They were essentially anarchists, but they were also pacifists. So they weren't violently overthrowing the state, but they were converting the state by saying the state needed to repent, and that people involved in the state needed to, repentance in this case means abdication. They need to resign. But Rushdoony wasn't seeing that, because he was more concerned with echoing or repeating what the church had always said about the state, which is that it was good, and that Romans 13 proved that it was good and we had to have it.
Right. Well, it's amazing that you were able to see that and that God like opened your eyes to see some of the inconsistencies that were kind of being promulgated by Rushdoony, or being like still held by Rushdoony, being stuck with those traditions. And you, as a younger man who's being, mentored by Rushdoony, probably isn't as held to tradition. You're probably wanting to examine all aspects, as sometimes younger men want to do. And so it's pretty amazing that you got to kind of open your eyes to those things. So what was the process then? Because everything you just said right there, that takes a little while to come to some of those conclusions. And the traditions are very strong, with the, interpretation on Romans 13, the non-pacifist type of interpretations of those things. So how did you eventually get there? Can you walk us through a little bit about how you got to that, how you realized that and figured it out?
I wish I could, because I could write a book if I could do that, but I really don't. I don't have it in my mind. I'm much better on thinking about what we should do in the future than what we have done in the past. And in my own life, I can't really recall how these steps, one step after another, took place.
Okay,
I
but
don't remember.
you mentioned that you were turned on to the Anabaptists, right? And that they had a different different idea of some of those passages, maybe? Is that something that influenced you, obviously?
No, not at that time. At the time I read Rushdoony in college, I hadn't really heard of the Anabaptists. And in fact, all of the Rushdoony people were saying the Anabaptists were bad people. So they weren't people you would look up to. They weren't people you would turn to for guidance.
Right.
They were sort of troublesome bad guys.
Is that because the reformers were the ones writing the history books about the Anabaptists because they were kind of in the winning seat, so to
Oh yeah,
speak?
Rushdoony was definitely aligned with Calvin and the reformers, or what we call the magisterial reformers. The Anabaptists were reformers as well, but
Right.
they were outside of the reformed Calvinistic circles. They
Gotcha.
had they had a different perspective. And the reformers tried to paint the Anabaptists as violent revolutionaries, which, I mean, there were violent revolutionaries, to be sure, at that time, back in the 16th century. But there's a difference between the what we might call the Swiss Anabaptists that came out of the split between Zwingli in Zurich and Conrad Grebel. Um, and then there's also those who were, even some, for example, who were former Lutheran pastors who became violent revolutionaries and engaged in all kinds of horrific practices like, group marriages and stuff like that. So there were crazy people, but the people I'm talking about when I talk about the Anabaptists are peaceful people and generally of a high moral character. So, but what the Calvinists did was they grouped them together, the violent revolutionaries and the peaceful Anabaptists. They grouped them together and they said those guys are bad guys. And Calvin, for example, dedicated his Institutes of the Christian Religion to the King of France and was trying to say, look, we're on the side of the state. All those other guys, they're bad guys. We're not part of them.
Wow.
Go ahead and execute them. Go ahead and put them all to death.
Oh my
Uh,
gosh.
yeah,
Wow.
not us though, not us. We're the good guys. We're the friends of the state.
Now, but there's a lot of Calvin that you would agree with. I would, don't you agree with like Calvin's doctrines of grace and Calvinism, with as far as predestination and those things are concerned?
Sure, and if you consider something like the Stone lectures that Abraham Kuyper delivered on Calvinism, he's talking about the arts and he's talking about all kinds of things, the way Calvinists look at the whole of life. So yeah, I would call myself a Calvinist 90%, as the same way I would call myself a Christian Reconstructionist 90%. I mean, I agree with Rushdoony 90%. The interesting thing is, though, if you disagree with Calvin or Rushdoony on the state and you call yourself an anarchist, it doesn't matter how much you agree with 90%, 95%, 99%. That 1% disagreement is really a passionate issue. And Calvin would put you to death. Rushdoony will excommunicate you. It's really amazing how passionate people are about that one issue on Romans 13 in the state.
Yeah, there's this tradition of upholding the integrity of the state and everyone believing that there is this legitimate right, that the state has this moral right to exist. They try to use certain verses to uphold that, like Romans 13, but Romans 13 just says that God ordains the state. But we also know that God ordains everything. He ordains the good and he ordains the bad. Even the greatest evil on the planet, which seems to be the state, pretty evidently. So God, Calvinism, right? He's sovereign over all things, even evil empires.
That's the message of Romans 13 and Romans 12. Romans 12 and 13 taken together as a unit is that we should have a peaceful attitude toward the state and seek to convert it by the preaching of the gospel and not to engage in a violent overthrow or a violent resistance against the state, because God is in control and God responds to society's moral framework with the state. I mean, if God wants to punish a society for its immorality, it'll send Caesar, it'll send invaders, it'll send Assyria, it'll send Babylon. All through the Bible, the whole Bible in the Old Testament, God judges societies by sending armies, by sending the state. And so the state is a tool of judgment in God's control and in God's hands. We're not to resist God's judgment by violence, but we are to recognize that the state is a symptom of society's evil. Like, for example, when Israel decided they wanted to have a state like all that, like the Gentiles, like the other nations, like Egypt and Babylon, God says, 1 Samuel 8, that's a rejection of God. So if a people vote for their own government, um, that's a rejection of God. Instead of having God as their governor, they want Trump as their governor. And so the state is both a symptom of a society's rejection of God, and it's also God's mechanism for judgment. Sometimes, though, it's not the state that the people vote for, it's a foreign state that God brings in to judge that people. So, for example, God wants to use, I don't know, a terrorist group, Iran, maybe. I don't know that Iran is all that bad, but if God wants to use Iran to judge the United States because the United States has become an atheistic nation, God can do that. God is in control. Romans 13 says God is in control, but also it says that we are to respond like the Anabaptists responded to the state and not by the way the Calvinists responded to the state. That seems to me to be the message of Romans 12 and 13.
So one state might be more tyrannical than another, but and the truth is that they're all bad.
Right. And it depends. And when you say a particular state is tyrannical or more tyrannical, it might be that it's more tyrannical toward one particular group of society and less tyrannical toward another group of society. A government could be very favorable and not tyrannical toward, say, homosexuals, but it could be very tyrannical toward Christians, just as an example of seeing how the state can be tyrannical to one group but not to another. But yeah, some groups, I mean, some governments are different, morally different than other governments, but it's the institution or it's the principle of the government that is in question here. It's the whole idea of having what political scientists refer to as a monopoly on violence, that a certain group of people, a small group of people, have the right to exercise violence over the larger part of society. Whether you call that an oligarchy or whether it's democracy, 51% ruling 49%, it's still one group of people smaller than the other group using the power of violence to get their way and force the other group to do what the larger or the smaller group thinks they should do. And that whole idea of having a government is a bad idea. It's number one, a rejection of God and God being our governor, but it's also a rejection of God's law in the sense that God's law says, no, don't steal, don't take other people's stuff, don't hurt people, don't engage in aggression. But if you don't have theft and you don't have aggression, you don't have the state. The state is institutionalized sin. And so when a people ask for this institution of sin, they're rejecting God as the governor and they're rejecting God's law as his standard for our behavior.
Man, that's so that's so huge. That's so fascinating. And it really is it's institutionalizing sin because they're by their very existence, they're having to break God's law in order to come into being. Isn't that right at the fundamental level?
Yeah, the state does not exist unless the members of the state are pledged, they have declared their allegiance to sin. We are going to steal from people. We are going to hurt people. We are going to aggress against people. We're going to violate God's law that God says don't do these things to other people. We're going to do them because we are the state and we get to do those things. We get to sin. We have a monopoly of violence. We have a monopoly of sin. We get to sin. Nobody else gets to sin against us. That would be wrong, but we get to sin. That's what the state is. We get to sin.
Wow. I went back to that passage about, I think it's Jesus maybe referencing Satan, but it says, or the enemy comes to seek to steal, kill, and destroy. Isn't that, and when I think about the state and I'm like, wow, I mean, that's like the state steal, kill, ultimately destroy people's lives. It's interesting how those are so parallel.
Yeah, well, that's why Romans 13 describes the state in terms of the powers, demonic powers. The state is, in Paul's day, demonic. Everybody understood that the state was animated by demonic forces. But obviously, the people in Caesar's government believed that the demons that were assisting Rome were the good demons. But Christians said, no, the demons that animate other governments outside of Israel are the bad guys. Those are bad demons.
It's
Israel's government was overseen by angels, but the other governments were overseen by demons.
It's really wild. I think you're totally right. And once you come to this idea, when you realize that that's what it's teaching, that that's actually the true interpretation to Romans 13, it's like you can't unsee it. You kind of see it all over the scripture, and then you realize, whoa, that's so much of what the Old Testament is about, is these like evil empires being animated by evil demonic forces. I mean, it's a spiritually dark world with one empire going against another, and then Israel just going into ruin, and enemies just battles and fights and blood and death. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, it's interesting how often Romans 13, the content of Romans 13 is taught elsewhere in the Bible, in the Old Testament. I mean, if you say, what are the essential core elements of Romans 13? God ordains the state, and the state serves God. The state is God's servant. How many times in the Old Testament does God say, Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar is my servant. He is serving my purposes. Don't resist him. How many times does God say, I'm sending the Assyrians? They are my servants. They are my ministers. Or Babylon, the Medes, all these different violent, psychopathic empires. God says, I'm in control and I'm sending them because you've rejected my government. You want your own government. Well, I'm going to send you a government. It's going to be the government from the Babylonians or the government from the Egyptians or whatever, but they serve God's purposes. These violent sociopathic entities are God's ministers. And the Old Testament says that from cover to cover. These are my ministers. They serve my purposes. Don't resist them. That's the main message. If you want to get rid of these ministers, then obey me, obey God. Let God be your governor. But that's what they didn't want to do. Israel didn't want to let God be the governor. They wanted some earthly creature governor, something like the Babylonians had and the Egyptians had. But that's Romans 13. That's Romans 13. I'm sending the sword. Assyria does not bear the sword in vain. Assyria is my minister. And, take it.
If you're not a Calvinist and you don't believe that God is sovereign over all the evil, do people just have a hard time thinking that God could be sovereign over evil? I
Probably.
don't, do they just have a hard time seeing the sovereignty of God in evil things? I mean, why would God only be sovereign over good things and not evil? If he's God, doesn't he have to be sovereign over the whole thing?
Well, I think that's what the Bible says. But yeah, I I can't recall right offhand conversation in which somebody objected to God's sovereignty over evil,
Yeah.
but they simply rejected or reacted to the idea that the state was evil. I think that's what people object to more than God's sovereignty. There may be obviously people out there who object to God's sovereignty over evil, but to me, it's the idea of saying that the state is evil in itself. The whole idea of having a state is evil. That's what people object to. I mean, the Bible is so clear that God sent Assyria against Israel, that God sent Babylon against Israel. It's hard to say, no, God is not sovereign over those nations. I mean, the Bible clearly says, I'm sending these evil governments to you. I'm sending the evil. I mean, it's over dozens of verses in the Bible that say that. I am sending evil to you because you've disregarded my law over and over. Well, that's Romans 13.
Well, and so much of the Bible seems to be kind of about this theme of disobedience and then an empire coming, and it's just the Old Testament is filled with story after story after story of this empire and that empire. I mean, it seems like this is a big chunk of the Bible.
Right. I mean, whole chapters are about this, if not whole books. I mean, most of the Bible is about the state. It's about the whole political issue here. Um, it's about governments. It's about the prophets telling governments what they're doing wrong. It's about God sending governments as a judgment against other people. I mean, the Bible is a political tract. I would call it an anarchist manifesto, but it's political. It's all about governments,
Yeah,
empires.
yeah, it really is. What do you think about the phrase good government? You ever heard that?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. No, I mean, we've said before just a few minutes ago that some governments are less evil than others.
Right.
Some governments, so I mean, you can say I want our government to be less evil,
Yeah.
but you really can't, that's not what the biblical ideal is. It's not to have one that's less evil. It's to have no evil at all. It's to get rid of evil.
Well, so okay, going back to Rushdoony and then to Rothbard. So Rothbard seems to have have the better understanding, pardon me, of the nature of the state. And so his starting place like gets him to the right place. And like Rushdoony has the right criticisms of the state, but still upholds its legitimacy, legitimacy. So, can you talk a little bit more about like Rothbard and like they both had analyses that were very critical, right, of the government, but they come to different conclusions.
Well, I would say they're 99% of their conclusions are similar, identical. And I
Okay.
wouldn't say Rothbard has the best starting point. I would say Rushdoony has the better starting point, but he's not consistent with that starting point. His position is that the Bible is our standard. The Bible is an authoritative history of empires, and he goes by the Bible 99% of the time. What Rothbard did was not give us a biblical understanding of the state, which I think is important. What he did was he showed how excuses for having a state are invalid. In other words, people would say, well, we need a state to build the roads. We need a state to have police. We need a state to do these things. And Rothbard said, no, you don't. We can do those things in a cooperative, consensual, contractual basis in the free market, in the private sector. We don't need a public sector based on theft and aggression. So that's why Rothbard came to good conclusions. He was just consistent with that operating assumption that you shouldn't hurt people and you shouldn't take their stuff. So that's why Rothbard was good. He was consistent with that moral principle. But I think Rushdoony was superior in that he anchored our morality in the Bible. Otherwise, why is it that if we're evolutionists and we believe that this life is a struggle and the fittest have to survive, why not take other people's stuff? Why not hurt people? If that's what it will take for you to survive and to be the fittest, why not? But Rushdoony said, no, there's an absolute morality because of God's existence and God's revelation of his morality to us. That's our starting point. But unfortunately, Rushdoony at some points deviated from the Bible as an authority and rested on the traditions of the theologians who were, to be harsh, they were the court jesters. They said what they needed to say to get the approval of the governments under which they lived. But the Bible always gets censored by governments because the Bible is antithetical to governments. And Rushdoony generally saw the antithesis, generally realized that the Bible was against governments. I mean, make a list of all the governments that are discussed in the Bible. And is the Bible favorable toward them? No. The Bible says these governments were bad and they were all overthrown. They were all destroyed by God, judged by God for their sin. But still, Rushdoony said, no, there is this ideal of a government out there that we have to strive for that ideal of a good government, as you said. And
Yeah.
we can't be without government.
So it only sounds like it sounds like Reconstruction can only go so far with that idea, with that premise, because Rushdoony's idea was the Reconstruction idea is to take all the different things in society and basically lay the Bible out as the Bible is the blueprint for everything, for every area of life, right? And so, but when it comes to the matter of the state and government, how does that all work itself out? Like the Institutes of Biblical Law, for instance, are you saying that his material can still work, but you just don't need the state to be the ones monopolizing that function?
If you look at Institutes of Biblical Law let me say that again. Yes, I think what you're saying is accurate, generally speaking. There are so many laws, so many commandments in the Bible. If we obeyed those commandments, we would not have a state. There's no commandment that says vote for someone to steal, vote for someone to aggress against other people. There's no verse that you can point to and says, this verse assures me that if I steal from people or if I hurt people, that God will not judge me in any way. He will not say, well, you shouldn't have done that. He will say, well done, good and faithful servant for stealing and killing. There's no verse that says that. but it's this idea that we have taken basically from the governments. I mean, the governments themselves have created these doctrines, these works of political science, which justify the existence of the philosopher kings, the rulers, and unfortunately, Christians, in what we would speak of as Christendom, have taken what these pagan authors have said about the need for government and incorporated them into the Christian system. But that was the wrong thing to do. Those governments, and like Aristotle has a book on politics. Well, Christendom, the church, however you want to describe that, basically said, well, let's do this. Let's follow Aristotle. Let's take some of his ideas and incorporate them into our doctrine of the state. That was a mistake, because Aristotle's doctrine of politics is not the biblical doctrine of politics. And Rushdoony, for the most part, would criticize Aristotle and wouldn't agree with what Aristotle said, but he was still part of that tradition, and he wouldn't let go of the state. He wouldn't let go and say, no, we don't need a state at all. And because he thought, well, that's anarchy, and I've always believed that anarchy was a bad thing, and he just couldn't do it. He was old school in that sense. He was part of his tradition. He was raised to believe that. He just couldn't get through that.
Okay, so we're only 2,000 years in, and it does seem like, would you say that there's been some progress made as far as like the divine right of kings and this type of like ruler idea? It seems like Western civilization has come a little bit away, breaking away from some of those traditions. And so, and it seems like, sadly, that's the Christians that are the ones upholding some of these false notions, ideas that the state has this moral legitimacy. And since we keep upholding the state, we believe in it, we believe in its existence and its right to do these things. And so then it just perpetuates this system of stealing, killing, and destroying. And so when do we come out of this? And when will we see a better day when we stop believing in the government? When does that happen? When we stop believing in the government? The anarcho-capitalist vision, is it possible? Is it a reality you believe will come into existence one day?
At the very beginning of our conversation, you talked about how a young man would break away from his mentor. And there's a book on that by a guy named Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but it works for political revolutions as well. I don't mean violence in the street, but I mean revolutions in political thinking. And that is, there comes a time when the next generation they're just scratching their head and going, why do you believe this? Why do you believe we need a state? And then all of a sudden, this idea of the state just goes away because, well, nobody believes that anymore. Nobody believes we need to have a monopoly of violence. Nobody believes we had to have philosopher kings or somebody ruling over us, somebody with the right to do things that the rest of us know are sinful. And that's this idea of the revolution. It's when the younger generation just says, with all due respect to the older generation, they said a lot of good things, but on this point, they were just unable to see what the Bible is really saying. They were tied to Aristotle or the other philosophers, but I just don't feel any allegiance to Aristotle. I just don't feel any allegiance to all these other political philosophers. I think we can go with the Bible and not have a state at all. And so it'll just be another generation that just hasn't been successfully inculcated with the idea that we have to have a state, and that anarchy, that is to say, having no state, but see, my vision of anarchy is, another word for my vision of anarchy is theocracy. Theocracy comes from two Greek words meaning God governs. Well, I believe we should have a society where God governs. If you turn God governs on its head, instead of saying God is over this nation, you would say this nation is under God. Well, America has always been a nation under God. It's always been a theocracy in that sense, not an ecclesiocracy, a dictatorship by clergymen, but it's been a society that recognizes the laws of nature and of nature's God. And so there's
Yeah,
going to be a generation is going to say, we want a theocracy. And
Yeah.
they mean that in the anarchist sense of that, and they're going to say we don't have to have an empire, we don't have to have a government, and it'll just kind of die away because people aren't going to be attached to that tradition anymore.
Yeah. I can see like people freak out with the idea of theocracy, but when you think of one nation under God, that's saying the nation is underneath God, theocracy. We're looking to God to direct. So they're already acknowledging, I mean, many people would say one nation under God, right? But I guess what does that mean? What would that look like? Can you paint maybe a little picture of what there seems to be a lot of false notions of what theocracy is and looks like, and what is it actually?
It looks like what America was 300 years ago. It was a nation under God, a nation that acknowledged God, a nation that believed it had an obligation to obey God's commandments. And the state played a very minimal part in their existence. Today, the state regulates and dominates every area of our existence and takes more than half of everything we earn. That didn't happen. The tax rate in colonial America under Britain, the total amount of taxes they took was 1 to 3%, according to historians. The government today takes more than 50% of everything we earn. It's a dramatic and in the eyes of America's founders, an intolerable tyranny. But that's because we've rejected theocracy. That is to say, we have rejected God, the God of the Bible, as our theocrat, and we have accepted Joe Biden and Donald Trump as our theocrats. Those are the people who are going to save us. Those are the people who are going to bring us into prosperity and peace, and not God.
So they were experiencing some type of theocracy and anarcho-capitalist world back then to a large degree. So it almost sounds like it goes in maybe in cycles sometimes, and then or maybe those ideas have been embedded in seed form, and now we need to take that seed and grow it, something like that.
Something like that. In colonial America, you had theocracy on the one hand, which is to say, we are a nation under God. We need to obey God. That was powerful. That was dominant. But you also have this belief that there has to be a government. And so after the American Revolution, 1776 and following, when they had abolished the government, and there's a speech that John Quincy Adams made after the revolution, and he said that the revolution abolished all government. There was no government in the colonies. All the state governments, what we call state governments, the colonial governments, were British governments, and they were all abolished. There were no governments. There was no federal government. There were no state governments. All government had been abolished. But they felt you had to have a government. So they all went about drafting up new constitutions for the states and creating government again. They should have just let it go at that point. Once they got rid of all the British government, they should have just said, okay, no more government. We're a nation under God, no more governments. They didn't do that, though. But the point I'm trying to drive at is that America at that point was 90% theocracy and only 10% government, just an arbitrary division. Don't get the numbers too detailed, but it was overwhelmingly theocratic and overwhelmingly not archist. But now the opposite is the case. It's 99% government and 1% theocracy. And that 1% theocracy is basically hypocrisy because you're not really taking that 1% seriously. It's just window dressing.
Yeah, well,
Another point I would make, what you said earlier about the state getting better or something like that, and you mentioned the divine right of kings. The divine right of kings was actually a good thing in the sense that there was this understanding that kings, when you say you get your authority from God, that's one thing, and I wouldn't agree with that. But it comes with it this understanding that you have obligations or duties to God. And those obligations limited the government. Even though they said they had a divine right of kings, they also believed that there were theological or theocratic duties that the king had. And that's why when you eliminate those theocratic or theological duties, as we have done in America in the last 200 years, the state becomes far more oppressive, far more totalitarian than it was under the divine right of kings. So I wouldn't say that government has gone better. You can see this, for example, in Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, Democracy, the God That Failed, that actually the divine right of kings had a more libertarian government and a more peaceful and free government than democracy, which is really, it's a ticket to totalitarianism, where so much of your lives are governed by the government instead of by God. and it's just much more tyrannical. So I wouldn't agree necessarily that governments have gotten better. They have gotten more, they've gotten better at marketing, and they tell themselves and their citizens that things are better. Things are better under our government than they were under the previous government. Boy, that's for sure. But that's a lie. That's not really true. Government has gotten more powerful, more demonic in a sense, it's gotten more evil. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and the propaganda's gotten worse. Well,
And that's because they control education, they control the schools, they control the next generation. That's what makes it difficult for the next generation to break away from traditions and create a revolution of ideas. It's because the government controls their education for the first 17 years of their life.
wow.
As more homeschooling takes place, people are going to be able to break away from the old traditions.
You really see, yeah, exactly. We've really seen how far away we've gotten from being a nation under God, and it's not good.
If your government doesn't recognize it to be under God, at least in some sense, then what happens is the government thinks it is God. The government thinks it is God. It can make any laws it wants. It can do anything it wants. It's God.
Yeah, and doesn't Rushdoony have a book called the like Messianic State or kind of thing?
Well, his book was called The Messianic Character of American Education, which was how 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the architects of modern public school system believed that an atheistic education could save America, could save the world. So that's what their idea was: get the kids into this new way of thinking, this new world order kind of thinking, and that will bring about salvation in the broad biblical, holistic, social sense of the word salvation, peace and prosperity.
Yeah. Okay, well, hey, can we talk a little bit about the banks and their involvement in all this? I've been going over one of your websites, and it's if you go to kevincraig.us, I really love how you have it kind of all laid out there, the economy, liberty under God, but you have a section about the economy and one called God, or the government steals from the poor. So I kind of wanted to just talk about that a little bit. Can you explain just to give a summary of how the government steals, like a big 10,000 foot view on how the government steals from the poor specifically?
Okay, the government wants to create a bureaucracy with lots of bureaucrats and likes to give jobs to bureaucrats. In order to fund the bureaucrats' salaries, the government basically prints up money. And when it does this, it sends all those bureaucrats armed with new money out into the economy. And those bureaucrats, those government employees, can start buying stuff from the shelves of Walmart. And when they do that, it causes the prices to go up because there's all this money chasing the same amount of boxes of cornflakes. It's not that they have made more boxes of cornflakes. It's just that they've made more money for people to buy boxes of cornflakes. So the bureaucrats go out there and they get their stuff, their groceries at today's prices. But tomorrow, when the single mother goes to the grocery store, all the prices have gone up. And the money that that person had, and they expected, I've got enough money here to buy cornflakes and milk, and that should do it. But when they get to the store, they can't buy both because the prices of both have gone up because all the government employees and all the people receiving government free money have already raised up the prices by buying stuff.
Right.
So the government has, in a sense, stolen from the poor, stolen from the people who don't have cushy government jobs, stolen from the people who are working hard to make ends meet, because they've created all this money and the bureaucrats have bought up all the things. And now the things are much more expensive. And so the poor are unable to buy the things they want. So the government stole a box of cornflakes from the poor by creating this bureaucracy and funding it with what they call fiat money.
How important is it for the government, in order for it to do all the things that it wants to do, have power over the money powers? Like it seems like the government needs to have control of the exercise or the printing of money in order to do the things that it wants to do. Is there some kind of link there when with the money and the governments?
Well, if we had honest money that wasn't based on government printing up money whenever it wants,
Yeah.
there would be a lot less money to
Right.
spend, and the government would have to compete. Everybody else has stuff they want to buy with their money, and probably if the government just simply asked, pretty please, can we have some of your money to do this bureaucracy, to do this thing, which isn't going to be of any benefit to anybody except the bureaucrats, everybody's going to say no. If there really was consent of the government, as the Declaration of Independence says, the vast majority of people are going to say no. What the majority of people do right now is they say, I want you to give me money. And so they want the government to print up money. But if you were to say, if people were to be asked, would you give the government your money to fund this bureaucracy? The vast majority of people would say no. Now, see, the government also takes money from other people and it gives it to the voters. And a lot of voters say, I'll vote for you to give me money, but I won't give you my money to you do what you want. And so that means the government has to print up money. In order to survive at its current level of expenditures and government employment, the government has to print up the money
Yeah.
in order for the government to do what it wants to do.
Right. And so how does this how does this credit I guess how do they inflate the currency? How does the government can you just explain simply as you can how the government goes about inflating the currency?
Well, I mean, you basically just said it when you said the government inflates the currency. In other words, it makes our money supply bigger by printing up new money, by creating new money. Now, one thing that happens a lot in our economy is non-government actors, non-government people also print up new money when they go to a government approved bank and they say to the government approved bank, I'd like some money to buy stuff. I don't have it, but I'm willing to go into debt for it. And the government approved bank says, okay, we've just zapped some money into your account and you can go out and spend it. And so there's the banks create money for debtors, but the bank also creates money for the biggest debtor, which is the government. So there's these two big classes of debtors. There's the government debtor, and then there's the private sector debtors. But they're all engaged in the business of creating money out of thin air.
Is it go back? You said something earlier about like this, it's being a symptom, like the government is somewhat of a symptom of the already existing disobedience of the people. And so it's kind of like a cause and effect problem of like an act of maybe an act of judgment. Is that the idea of like is the government that way because the people are that way essentially? Is that kind of what's going on?
Right. The government, in one sense, the government imposes its rule on people, but in another sense, the government has to gain the approval of the people to stay in business. And in many ways, the government tries to get people to want more government. If the government goes out and tells people, wouldn't you like more government? Oh, yes, you really would. And then the government say, okay, I guess I would. And then they go along with it. But uh, um,
Yeah.
if you have a society which is characterized by what sociologists have called the Protestant work ethic or the Puritan work ethic, and they believe it's necessary to work and produce things that other people want, sell other people what they want by producing what they want, and then you use the money you gain to buy the stuff you want. But it's work-based rather than theft-based. If people want something for nothing, if they want something without working for it, the people they go to get what they want is the government, because the government is that entity which creates money out of thin air and gives people what they want
Yeah.
without working for it.
One
But it's
one
that ethical work ethic is the issue here.
one of the things you put on your site, I love this so much, is even if the bank were giving away money interest free, or even if they were just giving it away for free, people should just not even accept it.
If you were going to the grocery store and in front of the grocery store, in front of the front door, there's this shadowy guy, this guy that doesn't look like he's legit. And he says, hey, are you going to buy some groceries? How would you like some more money to buy more groceries? And the potential customer says, well, why are you giving me money? And he says, well, I just printed up a whole bunch in my basement, and they can't see that I just printed it in my basement. They can't tell the difference. And so they'll accept my counterfeit money in exchange for the groceries you want. You have to, if you're a moral person, you have to say, well, I'm not going to take your counterfeit money, even if you're giving it to me, because that's theft.
Right.
That's not work-based, that's theft-based. And the government is the society's largest counterfeiter.
It really is, man. It's incredible, isn't it? Yeah, every act of credit expansion, which is undertaken by borrowing from a commercial bank, right, is an act of currency debasement.
It's an act of counterfeiting.
And it's creating a false weight, wouldn't you say?
It is because it represents to a potential seller that you're giving that seller. In other words, if I'm selling you something and I anticipate that the proceeds of what you give me for my product will enable me to buy a box of cornflakes, but by virtue of the fact that we're engaging in fractional reserve banking and printing up fiat currency and doing these things, when I go to the store, I find out, wait a minute, I can't buy a box of cornflakes. I thought I could buy a box of cornflakes with that money that I sold my product for. But
Yeah.
that's because the money is becoming devalued, debased. It's worth less and less. That's the essence of a false weight and measure. A false weight and measure in a society that's more primitive, more closer to a barter thing. It says, I'll give you a pound of gold for a pound of, I'm just making up numbers here. Don't go by literally, but let's exchange gold for wheat. I want your wheat. I have gold. I will give you gold for your wheat. And instead of giving an honest weight of gold, you give, say, for example, a gold coin that had the edge trimmed off. And you take 100 gold coins, you trim off the edges, and then you mix all the trimmings into a new, full, complete gold coin. That's a false weight measure. If you have a weight that you're using to weigh, balance the scales,
Yeah.
uh, with the one weight on one side and the wheat on the other side, but your
Yeah.
weight is actually smaller, then you're giving less wheat in exchange for the gold, and that's a false weight or measure. And so when the currency cannot be relied upon to give an honest trade, an honest exchange, because it's worth less than you're saying it is, you're representing this currency to be worth a certain amount in
Yeah.
exchange, you're stealing.
It's an act of dishonesty, and you're lying and ultimately stealing from that person, and God hates it, right? And he calls it an abomination over and over and over again through the prophets and Proverbs and the Old Testament.
Well, you had back in the days of the America's founding fathers, they understood this. That's why the Constitution says that only gold and silver can be a legal tender. And they understood that dishonest money results from these violation of these biblical principles. And one of a very famous essay by John Witherspoon, who signed the Declaration of Independence and mentored dozens of colonial governors and presidents at Princeton, wrote an essay on money, and Rushdoony has talked about that a lot. And they understood you're debasing the currency, you're cheating, you're stealing. This is all immoral. I think Rushdoony has a whole book on the immorality of inflation. I think it's called Larceny of the Heart. It's all spiritual disobedience and desire to get something for nothing, a desire to cheat other people and not work and not produce. It's a whole social depravity that cripples the whole society.
Yeah, it's a spiritual problem. That's his focus, right? It's like this is a spiritual problem that ends up as a practical. The larceny starts in the heart, right? And then it works itself out in these different ways.
The violation of the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet, usually precedes the violation of the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. So there's a spiritual dimension to all this theft. And the problem is theft is institutionalized by government. It becomes the standard operating procedure of the government is to engage in theft and to encourage everybody to engage in theft because it gives a kind of a feeling of instant prosperity, even though in the long run it dooms society. But voters tend to be impressed by instant prosperity in the short run, even if it's long-term disaster.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I'm getting into infinite banking, the infinite banking concept with started by Nelson Nash. I wanted to talk about his rule number 4 is don't do business with banks. And he talks about the problem of the inflation of the currency and stuff like that. So you would agree with Nelson Nash and say that we shouldn't be doing business with banks, obviously, because when we take out loans from the bank, we're engaged, we're locking hands with this inflation. We're creating money out of thin air. We're participating directly in that counterfeiting, right?
Correct.
And so
Right.
there's people within the IBC world who are a little seem like they're a little bit neutral on this point about doing business with banks, but I think it's maybe hard for people to really realize the act that's really being engaged in by the banks and by us when we uh, are the ones seeking out the loans from the banks for capital.
Maybe your phrase doing business with the bank is too broad
Okay.
because if you have money and you want to save it in a safe place, the bank could be a place where you could store your money and do it safely. So there's nothing wrong with depositing money in a bank just in itself. If you just think about this idea of I got some money and I want to have it in a safe place, maybe, I mean, you could debate that, I suppose, but maybe doing a business with a bank in that sense is okay. But it is, as you say, the problem of asking the bank for a loan, because in our current system, the bank is not engaged purely in loaning out what other people have saved, because the whole banking system has the power to create money out of thin air. And that's an act of theft. It's an act of debasing the currency, creating false weights and measures. It's that whole system is being, the fuse is lit by someone who goes to a bank and asks them for a loan.
And that's exactly what they're doing, right? When they're creating a new loan, they're opening an account in such and such's name, and they're just entering blips into a computer.
Right,
That
right.
accurate to say,
Creating new money.
and then there you are, inflating the currency and creating inflation, and now the purchasing power, in theory, of everyone's dollar is getting less, a little bit less, right?
When you say the purchasing power is less, that's the way an economist would say it. But what you're really saying is, I have stolen from other people's ability to buy a box of cornflakes. I have stolen what they were thinking they were going to buy, and I'm going to buy stuff now before they buy it because I've got this new money. But it's theft.
Yeah, and I think that's what Nelson Nash was when you read him, what he was really saying. He was saying, don't take loans out from banks. He had an alternative idea by taking loans out against your life insurance policy, because when you take out a loan out from the insurance company, you're not engaging in the credit expansion. You're not creating the insurance company is not creating money out of thin air like a bank does. So I think we could say to resist the banks when it comes to needing capital and taking loans out for stuff we want to buy, like homes and cars or anything else.
There's two separate issues involved in this, in what we're talking about right now. One issue is debasing the currency and creating false weights and measures, which the current banking system does. But then there's a question of, should I borrow from a mafia loan shark? Should I borrow from my neighbor who says he'll loan me some money? That's a separate issue. It's not the issue of debasing the currency. It's the issue of, what does the Bible mean when it says the borrower is the slave of the lender? And in 1 Corinthians 7, that we're not supposed to become a slave of any man. So there is a strong thread in the Bible of not borrowing. So there's that question. Are we engaged in covetousness when we borrow?
At all. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So that it's not, there's one question, should I borrow at all? And the other question is, should I borrow from someone who's debasing the currency in order to give me a loan?
Yeah, there is a big emphasis on what you just say, like self-sufficiency as Christians, which allows us to be in a position to, I guess, be free and to ultimately serve others.
Right. And like I say, in many cases, the act of becoming a slave, when the debtor becomes the slave of the lender, that might be based first on covetousness. You're wanting to get a loan for something that instead of having that thing now, like say you want a boat, go out and get a loan for a boat. Well, maybe what you should do is work extra hours, save up the money, and then buy a boat next year. And that would be, I think, a more biblical way of obtaining what you want. Uh, but then you have to ask yourself, for a lot of things, do I really need to buy this, or is there some other place I should put my money rather than buying this or that? So you can look at this from lots of different dimensions. The debasement of the currency issue, the covetousness issue, the lost opportunity issue. For example, if you buy this, if I buy a boat, am I precluding my possibility of subsidizing the Christian education of my next door neighbor or something like that? Some more charitable good, a lower standard for you, but a higher standard for your society by helping those who are in need of some other spiritual gift. So there's lots of questions to be asked here, and it's a good idea to keep them separate and analyze them separately, because you could justify a loan, or you could justify asking someone for money on some basis that doesn't involve debasing the currency and creating false weights and measures, if you see what I mean.
Do you think there's any situations where you can borrow without covetousness?
Well, maybe without covetousness, but then you have to ask the question, what is it meant when it says the borrower is the slave of the lender? And then couple that with the verse that says, be not the slave of any man. I mean, if you take those two verses together, it's virtually saying don't borrow. So I don't, and Rushdoony and others have made that claim. I mean, I'm not just making that up, that they have made that claim. They've said, look, here's what we're saying. And Romans 13:8, owe no man anything. So there's like I say, there's a thread of teaching in the Bible that's anti-debt. It's anti-borrowing. And that's a separate question from anti-false weights and measures,
Right.
because technically you could borrow without creating false weights and measures.
Yeah.
So you have to look at those separately. And
When
then in addition to the borrowing, is the borrower is the slave of the lender.
yeah.
That's an issue. But then there's the issue of what am I borrowing for? And am I borrowing something that's simply out of covetousness or materialism or something like that, and neglecting other opportunities for.
Right. There's plenty of things that people it's all a matter of a lot of it's a matter of the heart, I think. When what are you borrowing for? Are you borrowing
Right,
so you can spend it on your lusts, you know?
right.
So yeah. What the Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution says no state shall emit bills of credit. Is that just talking about is that talking about fiat currency in their minds? Were they talking about fiat, like a bill of credit? Can that be a piece of paper that you can still like go and get gold for? Or
I
what?
think it's talking about debt. I think that's the essential point to make. There's a scholars have done some writing about the actual meaning of that phrase, and it's I don't think it's necessary to get into some of the historical nuances of what exactly a bill of credit is, but
Okay.
it is a debt instrument.
Okay. Were they talking about fiat currency then?
I think when they're talking about fiat currency is when they say no state shall make anything but gold or silver a tender in payment of debts, or whatever the language is right there. Do you have that in front of you? I don't
Yeah, I
remember.
do. No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Yep.
Yes. So that's the currency issue. I mean, that's so crystal clear.
That's
It's
so
just
plain as
amazing.
day. How
Yeah.
how are we not following that?
And how can you have that in the Constitution and then have FDR confiscate everybody's gold? It's like it's total mind-numbing madness that people are just like they take an oath to support the Constitution, and the Constitution is so clear, and then they just do something which is completely opposite of what the Constitution says.
Now, would you be in favor? You said maybe like going back to what James Madison described as sound money, or would you want to go back to the gold standard, or can people just decide for themselves what they want to trade with, essentially?
Well, one problem with the word gold standard is that it implies something that's imposed or regulated by the government.
Right.
which obviously in an anarcho-capitalist society, you wouldn't have government regulating coinage. People could use Spanish doubloons, or they could use South African Krugerrands, or they can use any coin they want. But generally speaking, a vibrant economy is going to um, agree on certain protocols, certain procedures, certain ways of doing things, which have a tendency to monopolize, not in a bad sense, but create a system that is reliable. So whatever the market, people who engage in trading should be able to decide for themselves what they want to trade with. If you're buying something on Facebook Marketplace, you can agree to use a certain currency, a certain gold coin, or anything you want. People should just be allowed to trade with whatever they want. You want to make sure that as an individual, I'm using God's standards of exchange. And you would also like to exchange with someone else who is honoring God's standards and not giving you false weights and measurements. So you want to apply biblical principles, but the market, people in the free market should be allowed to decide how to obey biblical principles any way they want.
Yeah.
So that's what some people would call free coinage, free currency, Bitcoin if you want. I don't know if Bitcoin is a violation of biblical standards or not, but if assuming it's not, people could be free to exchange any way they want.
Yeah. I just got finished reading The Case Against the Fed by Rothbard himself, and he had kind of the solution at the end of the book, saying that by ending the Federal Reserve, a lot of their things, a lot of their assets, I guess, could be liquidated, and I guess was it sold off? I can't remember. But then he would price. They have some gold reserves, and said that they would just reprice that gold in whatever. I'd have to go back and look at it, but he made it sound really simple. The solution to getting back, basically just abolishing the Fed, seemed like it solved a huge problem.
So
They
you're talking about privatizing Fort Knox. Is that pretty much what you're saying right now? Is that what you're talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah, I can't
Yeah.
articulate it very
Yeah.
well, but
See, what has to happen is there has to be such a groundswell of voter demand for something to happen that the government is trying to honor that pressure, that political pressure, and they don't get caught up in details. They just say we got to get this done, so they get it done quickly. That's what I think Rothbard is saying. Also, George Reisman in his book on capitalism has a plan for how to price gold and move gold from the public sector to the private sector. So there are ways to do this, but there has to be enough political pressure from voters to say, we want it done, we want it done now, just get it done. And then you don't argue about all these details, you just get it done, and then everybody's glad that it's got done.
Kevin, on my I don't know, can you see my books here?
I can see,
So I've got
yeah, I can see a Bible for New Liberty. I can't see the other one. The light
well,
is
this one's
reflecting
the
on.
creature from Jekyll Island, and then
Oh, okay.
becoming your own banker. Um, I I guess I see becoming your own banker as one of the um, I guess solutions that people can take, or off ramps that people can take, at least a step getting away from the banks, and having to go to the banks for capital, um, for their borrowing. So you would lean a little farther than those ideas by saying you question borrowing altogether. Um, would you say that I guess would it be a I guess I don't know if you'd call it a step in the right direction. I think we've had that conversation before, but um, yeah, I guess my hope and desire is to wake people up to the inflation problem and the theft that is taking place, the legal counterfeiting that the bank is engaged in, but also that we as individuals are participating in when we go to the bank, and how it really hurts them. It hurts them, and it hurts society. So
Well, I would certainly agree that you want to get people out of that government chartered banking system. You want to get out of a system which employs false weights and measurements for its very existence and get into something else. That is a step in the right direction, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, okay, I'll finish with this. You say that paper money, maybe fiat currency, is the antithesis of everything the Hebrew Christian religion stands for.
Well, yeah, it's a society that, wow, that's a hard to explicate that. I mean, that's a lot of different ways to illustrate that. I don't even know where to begin. But yeah, when you have a society which is basically wanting to accumulate rather than wanting to give, wanting to serve. Let me go back to the question of anarchism. I think one of my favorite passages on anarchy or anarchism is Mark 10, verses 42 to 45, where Jesus says, "Don't be like the kings of the Gentiles. Instead, be a servant." Because what kings do is they conquer for themselves. They conquer, they accumulate, they tax. But Jesus says, don't be like them. Don't be like those who use lawless, immoral means to get stuff for themselves, but rather be a servant and be willing to give what you have to others. So in this way, the same way, this is the whole fractional reserve banking system and currency, debased currency, is a lawless and immoral way of people trying to get something for themselves rather than thinking about how they can serve others. They want others to, if I'm engaging in this process, it's because I want others to serve me. I want stuff for me, and I want others to be forced in some way to give me what I want, rather than thinking about how it is I can serve others. Think about Jesus in the third section of Matthew 25, where he says, the Bible says it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this is judgment. What does that judgment look like? Jesus says, you gave to those who were hungry, you gave to those who were thirsty. James 1:27 says, true religion is protecting widows and fatherless children. In other words, this basic principle that we're going to be judged on is how well did we raise the material and spiritual standard of living of others? That should be our focus. How can I raise the standard of living of my neighbor, of my society? How can I raise the standard of living? And instead, our modern debt economy and our false weights and measures, it's all about how can I get for myself, even at the expense of other people, even at the lowering other people's standard of living to raise mine. And so that's the antithesis. Instead of serving, instead of being a servant, we want to be a conqueror. We want to have the power of the state to conquer other people and confiscate from them. It's all about confiscation rather than service. So that's the antithesis that I'm trying to draw. And that's, I mean, even the Old Testament talks about widows and orphans and doing justice and stuff like this. But the great goal here is to raise the standard of living of others, starting with our neighbor. But eventually, if we do these things right, we raise our whole society's standard of living, materially and spiritually. But you don't do that if everybody's trying to be their own God. Everybody's in this struggle for life to be the survival of the fittest, and they're only thinking about themselves and willing to conquer others, willing to steal from others. And so that's the antithesis between ruling and serving. That's what I meant in that.
That's great. Stop ruling and start serving. And that's what we all need to be doing, is serving and telling those people who are ruling to stop and to start serving like the rest of us, trying to, not the rest of us, but the people who are trying to make ends meet and trying to make it out there in the free market, hopefully trying to find a product or a service that we can do or make in order to make other people's lives better and make, kind of like the idea of heaven on earth by blessing others as much as we can. And and when that is being done on a mass scale of everyone doing that, the world is going to just like multiply and prosper like nothing you've ever seen before.
Well, that's what Deuteronomy 28 says. If we do things God's way, our society will experience a greater level of peace and prosperity. We think that we have to do things our way to get peace and prosperity, to get what we want right now, but that it doesn't work that way. When we try to do it in the manner of conquest, if we try to be archists, if we covet being an archist, then our whole society falls. So it's counterintuitive in the sense that you think that if I'm giving it away, if I'm helping others, that's not going to help me. But it does. The influence that you have spiritually and materially when you're giving to others and being a servant instead of an archist. I mention that in Mark 10, when Jesus says, don't be like the kings of the Gentiles, he says the kings of the Gentiles like to be archists. And the word there in Mark in the Greek is the word from which we derive the English word anarchist, which means not an archist. That's what the word means, not an archist. So Jesus is saying, don't be an archist. Don't be somebody who's concerned about conquering other people for your benefit, but rather be a servant who's willing to be the slave of others. And you think, well, gee, if I'm going to be a slave, I'm just not being practical. I'm not being focused on what I need to do to help my family and these kinds of things. But actually, you are helping raise the standard of living for your posterity by being a servant rather than an archist. And that's the whole thread from beginning to end of the Bible. It's anti-archist and pro-servant, or you might even say pro-slavery, which it freaks people out. They say, "Oh, it can't be a slave," and it's true. I mean, that's what Proverbs 22 says: the borrower is the slave of the lender, and that's interesting. That's not a good thing to be. Paul says, "Don't be the slave of any man" in 1 Corinthians 7. But that's because if you're the slave of someone, you're doing something else. You're doing what other people tell you to do and not able freely to do what God tells you to do. And so we want to be slaves to God, but not to any other man.
Yeah, that's great, man. I mean, Jesus says it is better to give than to receive. You give, and he's like, see what I'll just test me in this, see what I'll do, and he pours down blessings and 100-fold. When we use our time and energy, and I've noticed that in my own life when we tend to get selfish with our time, but I notice that when I serve people, man, there's just good things that like I learned more, and it just I don't know, things come back and pile on top of you on in a way that you weren't expecting. And so the God's way is better than our way, and when we spend our time loving and serving others, it ends up being the best thing for ourselves and for our family, for sure. So
When you say you learn things in serving others, that's an important point because we're not supposed to simply raise the standard of the material standard of living of others, but also their spiritual standard of living. So when you give a gift of a meal to someone, don't just give the meal and walk away, but make that meal a centerpiece of a learning experience where you're also raising their spiritual standard of living by helping them understand the Bible more, helping them apply the Bible to their lives. It's an educational thing as well. So yeah, you learn by giving, but you also help the beneficiary of your gifts, not just to get something like a meal or something, some other form of assistance, but to
it's
also assist them in becoming better people themselves.
your example is a teaching tool to them and to those around you. I mean, I have got my kids that I'm discipling every day because they're around me and we do life together. So they're looking, they're watching all the time.
Right. So it's always thinking about not just the material standard, although that's something that I think we've lost a lot of that because we want to accumulate materially for ourselves. We're not willing to give materially to others. But also, and Jesus says that I gave to the hungry, I gave to the thirsty, but I think also we have to continue to educate people in terms of God's commandments and how that makes a better society.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kevin, it's so refreshing to talk to you about the Bible and the way you're able to take the Bible and just lay it out in such a practical way that can really change the world when society decides that we're going to stop believing in the state and its legitimacy, which isn't real, and start serving others. And so. Yeah, thanks for going through and walking us through several texts and several scriptures. Your overall understanding of the Bible is really a really awesome gift that you give to others. Can you tell our audience like where people can reach you and how they can learn this worldview that you present so well?
Well, I'm working on trying to create a platform to spread this out. I'm calling it Vine and Fig Tree University. The URL of it's very tentative. It's just the first draft, but vineandfigtree.university. Some of that material is also repeated on another website called vineandfigtree.org. Vine and Fig Tree is the name of the 501c3 ministry that I incorporated years ago to try to promote this idea that's found in one of, some historians say, was the most popular Bible verse in America 300 years ago, which talks about a day we beat our swords into plowshares and everyone dwells peacefully under their own vine and fig tree. So that's the idea there. A society that's free from princes and pirates, and people are working productively. They have their own property. They're producing for the benefit of others and receiving the reward of living in a peaceful and prosperous society. So that's the idea, Vine and Fig Tree Society.
Well, I have to say that Vine and Fig Tree has been a huge blessing in my life. This worldview. Thank you so much for spending all the time that you have on so many web pages. It has impacted me tremendously. It's changed my life. It's affecting my family and my children, my wife, and people around me. So thank you for taking the time to work hard for the benefit of others. And so I hope people will reach out to you and find Vine and Fig Tree. And it's such a tremendous resource. So thank you so much.
Well, I encourage communication and questions. I'm happy to help, and I'm grateful and gratified that it's been helpful for you.
Well, you've sharpened me so much. So thank you for joining us today, Kevin.